Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I think it's a great day, and I think it's been a great project that you've all been doing, and raising awareness, but also doing your conservation. And I hope that perhaps in the days ahead, when we can actually move about and do things together, you might be considering carrying out a fuller survey of all the memorials in your churchyard. So I'm going to be talking today about why memorials are so important. And I'm going to be talking about memorials in general. There are lots of regional differences, and what you have in any one particular place may vary. So not everything that you'll see in this talk will be represented in any one place. But that's indeed one of the enjoyments of being interested in burial grounds and recording them, is that you can move around the country, or indeed the world, and see very different ways in which the dead are commemorated. So what is the historic and cultural heritage significance of churchyards and their monuments? And the first thing is the point I was just making: they're everywhere. Every community has some way of disposing of their dead, and often this involves some form of commemoration. Also, in the burial grounds, there are usually many monuments, and there are other features which are also interesting. You've been hearing about the ecological value of burial grounds, but they contain a wide range of cultural manifestations, not only the monuments, but also the paths and the way the ground is laid out, the walling round the edge, the gates, which can sometimes be quite elaborate, and there may be other features in the graveyard as well, such as older crosses and so on. The landscape itself includes cultural features, lots of plantings, sometimes on graves, sometimes leading up the paths. And in the past, those plantings might have been quite different. And if you have old photographs or illustrations of graveyards in the past, they can have quite different sets of plantings. So that is an interesting dynamic in itself. And I mentioned about how monuments are not the same everywhere. So as you travel around, you will notice these changes in regional identities and styles once you get your eye in. And it's also important because we need to realize that we are in an extremely privileged position in the British Isles in the richness of our cultural heritage that we have in our grasp. Elsewhere in Europe, in many countries, not all, but in many countries, the burial record is much more limited because only the most important people's graves have been preserved. And elsewhere, the top right there is Greece, it's Crete, and the bottom is Denmark. Reveal this pattern of grave reuse over a period of perhaps only 25 or 40 years. And so most of the monuments are relatively new, and there's a rapid recycling of the ground. This means they don't need graveyard extensions and so on in the same way, but it means that their cultural heritage and the richness of those past commemorative traditions is lost as the monuments are replaced. And you can see at the top one, this is a new development with a new area being refurbished. The row behind to the right, you can see, is all now occupied. Here we can see it's partially occupied. They're just getting these ready for new occupants. And then to the left further, there was a completely cleared area. So this is the sort of cycle of reuse. If you look at a Google map of Venice, you can see the island that is the cemetery island, and you can see it looks like crop rotation from the air, with the areas with the filled graves and the areas that have been cleared. And you can see how it's been organized to rotate round. So we have an awful lot of information in this country that we should treasure and appreciate. And I think we should also record for posterity. So they're historically valuable, partly just because of the ages they cover, but they're important because they're not just popular culture, they're popular culture, not just elite culture. So these monuments are being constructed by local workmen in many cases, and they are for the local people, many of whom are not affluent from the early to middle of the 19th century onwards anyway. And these people are choosing to invest some of their surplus income in the creation of family memorials. They're accessible and easy for us to see. We can just wander around and have a look. We don't have to get lots of permission. We don't have to pay entrance fees. They're a very important outdoor but accessible, usually good parking nearby and so on. It's a very, very easy way of experiencing part of our local heritage. So this makes them historically valuable. I've got repeated the same points again, and they're important that they're an educational resource for adults to go and look, but also for schools. Schools could certainly do a lot more on the cultural side of burial grounds in their locality. We see in the 18th and then through the 19th century a boom in the number of memorials being erected. And I give on this slide a whole series of reasons as to why that boom might take place. These are not mutually exclusive. How many of them are important in any one area? It would involve a lot more research to tease out. But you can see there are lots of things happening, all of which contribute to the fact that many more people are putting up memorials on their family plots. After about the 1840s, this is much more difficult to measure because any one burial ground may not be the only one in an area that is in use. You have lots of different burial grounds in use from the 1840s onwards. You have cemeteries, you have nonconformist chapels, you have the Anglican churchyards still being used. And unless you've done all of those in a region, you can't really easily grasp how this is going up. Wherever you look, you will see this boom. The exact point at which it takes off and the extent to which the graph gets steeper and steeper will vary from place to place. And there are a few places in the country where these graphs really start to go up in the early 18th century. But in most cases, it's in the mid to late 18th century. And in some places, it's only in the early 19th century that this boom really begins. But there's lots of issues behind this, of which population and literacy are some. The increasing middle classes wanting to have a consumerist perspective on life, and they want to display their material wealth competitively. Better links to move materials around so people have more choices in the material of the stones. Some of these things we will see as we go through. Now, I make this claim that many people have these monuments. How can we demonstrate that? Well, when we have memorials in burial grounds where we have good burial records, which sadly is often not the case in nonconformist burial grounds, but in Anglican burial grounds, we often have good burial registers, and the same in cemeteries. And we can see the way in which the memorials increase during the first part of the 19th century. And then you can also see how the number of people commemorated is also going up, because of course there can be more than one person on any one memorial. And we can compare that with the number of burials that take place. And we can see in the early 19th century, and of course the same would be true even further back, there is a very small minority who are being commemorated. And then that rises, and then we can see that it actually stays remarkably constant for about the mid up to late 19th century onwards. So even today, quite a significant number of people are not commemorated with a monument in a burial ground. But a very significant proportion are, and that proportion includes right across the social spectrum. Now, on these monuments, not only do we see over time that the number of monuments is we also see the character of the monuments change. And we see here some of the earliest forms of design, symbolism on the monuments that we find in a few areas. You see these more often on monuments inside churches because they go back further in time. And we have only a few areas in Britain where the monuments are early enough that this is the common motif. But it's the symbols of mortality. Skulls, crossbones, not pirates, but mortality symbols, but also other symbols too. We have hourglasses, we have coffins, and we have bells. These are common symbols. In some areas, we also have the figures of death, scythes, sexton's tools, other sorts of symbols can occur. And these occur in particular regions and have particular regional styles. So the one at the top left is in Bedfordshire, the one at the bottom left is in Scotland, and the one on the right is in Ulster. After the mortality phase, we get a cherubs phase, and this is much more widespread. There are far more areas with memorials in by the time we get to the cherubs. And here we see the cherubs looking sometimes rather apprehensive and sometimes rather cheerful. They vary greatly in how they appear and how they've been carved. The top left one shows the sort of crossover between the mortality and the cherubs. The cherub may be representing here the soul flying up to heaven, but in the corners of this one on the top left, you can see an hourglass on the left and the crossbones on the right. So this is a sort of transition example between the mortality emphasis, which is on the way in which the body is decaying in the ground, and the memorial is marking the body, through to the more optimistic view of this marking the grave, but the spirit has been released and is going to heaven. The negative is also seen on the top left one by "Be ye ready," which is a little motif there written across the top above the wings of the cherub. And that type of warning we often have associated with mortality stones, and sometimes that survives longer. A warning from the dead to the living to mend their ways so that they may not suffer a judgment which they would rather not have. You can see in the others a variety of the ways in which the cherubs are represented. So as you go about looking in graveyards, you will notice that cherubs are often carved very differently in regional styles, usually rustic regional styles like the ones at the bottom, but sometimes in much more sophisticated Rococo styles, like you see on plasterwork and so on in country houses, like in the top right. So some of the styles are much more sophisticatedly designed, and some of them are much more folk art character. We then move on to urns, to an emphasis now on remembering. And the bottom right one is a sort of Victorian one, continuing this with the sort of grieving scene and the weeping willows. Top right is also weeping willows for remembrance. But we have, before those come in, just straight urns with usually some vegetation. And just as the cherubs can be represented in lots of different ways, so the urns can be all sorts of shapes, and they can be carved by incision. They can be carved like the one bottom left by the stone being cut back. There are various ways in which they can be depicted, but the urn is very common. In North America, in New England, the urn is always appearing with the willow. Here, they are often separated. You have vegetation with the urn, but not necessarily a willow. And we also have, moving to the Victorian period, which we'll come on to in a minute, this sort of shaking hands farewell motif, which is the husband and wife, as you can tell from the style on the cuffs, one saying goodbye to the other. And in the Victorian period, we get a huge explosion in the number of designs available for people to choose. So not only has there been a boom in the number of memorials being erected, but the consumer choice explodes. And this is in part because a lot of designers, architects and so on get interested in designing memorials, and they do design books which they sell, and local masons acquire these and have inspiration about how they might do designs. But also we begin to see slightly more interest in the public in having more elaborate monuments further down the social scale. And this opens up a whole new market of variation, and people want to fit within broad parameters of what is traditional, but at the same time want to branch out and show their difference. Really important in these types of communities to realize that people are wanting to conform, but at the same time are wanting to be part of a sort of a picture which shows them as distinct, and that so their stone wants to be different. And we see here the IHS, there's an I in the middle, then there's an H, and then there's the S of the monogram of IHS, Jesus in Greek. Have a biblical representation on top left with Welsh language inscription there, particularly popular in Wales, but you do get it. You get lots of Bibles and open prayer books and so on in England. And then the bottom two are showing flowers, extremely common. The one on the right showing the stem being cut by a sickle, showing life being cut short. Lots of flower symbolism, vegetation symbolism in the memorials as well. Haven't got time to discuss that today. So what we see in these memorials is very much a pattern of rustic production early on, and local craftsmen, often starting off only part-time, creating monuments in their region. Their market area might be quite small. It might only be a few miles. Some of these craftsmen and their workshops gradually get bigger and bigger zones. They become very popular. But also a lot of those styles are actually similar in a region, are being carved by a number of people who may or may not have been all trained in the same workshop originally, but copy each other, and you get this sort of rippling out. So you get these regional styles that are bigger than any one carver, but you may be able to look at the details of the carving, of the lettering or of the symbols, of the designs and how they're done, and identify particular masons and carvers. Relatively small numbers of memorials, sadly, particularly in the early period, are signed. So that is a real challenge. So you can see here an array of different types of local craft products. The ones on the left, pretty unsophisticated. The ones on the right, becoming rather more organized, competent. The other ones are confidently done, but there is a certain charm to them which is a bit rudimentary. The ones on the right show a much more sophisticated, sure hand in terms of the design, and more of a relationship with other items of material culture and print and so on, and those design features that are seen there, and the awareness of how these memorials sit within the wider material culture is perhaps a bit clearer. We also see a change from material that is each unique and carved by that carver completely, which we see, for example, on the left here, to the ones that are bought in and only lettered locally, which we see on the right. So the one on the right is Aberdeen granite here in Wales, so the Welsh language inscription. So the memorial is selected from a pattern book, a printed pattern book produced by the quarry carvers, and it has the shape and all the decoration already prepared at that workshop near the quarry, and then it comes on the railway or however, and comes to the mason, who then adds the inscription. The bereaved family will be choosing that memorial from a catalogue or from one that the mason already has in his showroom, but those carvings are themselves done in a standard workshop setting and sent all over the country and indeed abroad. So there is a change in the marketing and production in a very fundamental way, which really completely alters the sort of dynamic of the market in the 19th century, and then runs on, and of course is really the market we have today. The pre-shaped stones now come from abroad or wherever, and are then just carved with their inscription and now etched designs locally. The geology of memorials then also changes, in part because the ones that are later are coming made of the stone wherever those production centres are. But we have a lot of variation, therefore, regionally in the beginning, because they're using whatever their local stone is. And so the top one there shows a slate headstone, for example. You might be in an area which has sandstone or limestone or whatever. Then the first ones to appear, usually in ports, are marble. Many internal memorials were already using marble. So to use marble outside gives it a sort of cachet of status and importance. And then the imported materials begin. We get marble coming from Italy, the Carrara marble, and we also get these Scottish granites. And now we have stones from all over the world being used on memorials. Some churchyards demand local materials, but many cemeteries and graveyard extensions are happy to accept memorials made of any materials. At the bottom left there, you can see the way in which the local slate in a particular area has its own peak, and then the non-local takes over and becomes the dominant kind of material used. Within that non-local, there's a lot of variety. Of course, we talk about gravestones and tombstones, but not all memorials are made of stone. And in this industrial 19th century context, we have a whole plethora of other materials that are used, most notably cast iron. And there are two main types that you can look out for. There are the ones that are bespoke cast for a particular person, a particular time. The one in the top middle is like that. The lettering is raised because it is pressed into the sand of the mold, like having a printer, to create the depressions in the sand, which then the molten iron will fill. And so that is a bespoke memorial done with that text at the local foundry. And then you have the other top right, which is one that is mass produced, and the local undertaker or whoever paints the text or has the text painted onto the panel beneath the urn. You can see there are rather splendid urns. So how these styles that you see on the stones are converted onto other materials. Bottom left one is a homemade memorial. So happens this one is made out of metal. You sometimes very occasionally get them in concrete. And then we also have, in some places quite a few, in other places very rarely, ceramic memorials. The bottom right is a rather smart, bespoke terracotta memorial, extremely elaborate. But the bottom center is one that is a Northeast England style, lasts a few decades, where again it's a bespoke memorial. You can see the text in the middle. You won't be able to read it, but you can see the text, and that is raised and it's been glazed a different color. So the whole thing has been produced at one go. It's a rather bizarre ceramic fake wood look with little flower vases built in on the sides. So that's a sideline of some ceramic production company in the northeast. I've yet to track them down, that produced these memorials for a while. We also get them in the war, the Second World War, with black glazed material on the surface, which makes them look like they're black granite. Clearly, there were problems of supply of granite memorials at that time, and there is a production which lasts a little while after the war as well, where these imitation granite memorials became fashionable, and they can be quite difficult to spot unless they're slightly damaged and you can see the chipping and see beyond the glaze to the fabric, the material of the clay underneath. They're very, when they were new, they would have looked very convincing. So we've seen changes in the way the monuments are produced. We've seen changes in the way in which they are distributed, and we've also seen that they can be in a range of materials. But there's also the shape and overall style of that monument, which sometimes, of course, complements, though sometimes strangely jars with, the motifs and the styles that they resonate with when you're looking at them. Some memorials are a real dog's breakfast of different styles together, suggesting that the designer didn't quite understand the aesthetic of the different styles. But we have across the memorials lots of major styles which we see also in architecture being represented in these monuments. And this is another example of where popular culture is able to invest in particular, in a sense, architectural styles, even though they may not be able to make those sort of choices about the buildings in which they live. We see in this slide here a variety of the styles that are classically related. So some are inspired by the designs of Roman altars. Some, like the top right, are linked to the Greek stele, the Greek grave slabs of the classical world. And then some of them are classical revival architectural features, such as the one on the left, which is very reminiscent of a sort of Georgian style doorway. And indeed, where some of these come from in southwest Wales, there are streets of houses with doorways that look almost identical to these monuments. So you can see that the classical style was really an important element in the design choices that people made after the rustic styles were running out. And at Bishop's Castle, you have these in several cases. You have some of these are the ones which you have been conserving and doing a wonderful job about transforming them from the state they're in to a much more stable and understandable, intelligible state that they are today. So these are Bishop's Castle examples, and I've got these pictures from the conservation document. I'm very thankful for being able to have those to put in here, so you can see how the styles in your burial ground are representing these national styles and how they were picked up and run with by people in your area. Obviously, in these cases, the relatively affluent people. And you can see that this chest tomb here has these urns on the corner. It's got some classical columns, and then there are the lines of tombs which have these are very box-like, a bit like an altar, and then they also have these urns on the top. And conserving and reassembling these has been, as you know, those of you who've been there and watching this process, quite a long and complex business. And it's interesting when these monuments are being reassembled. I really enjoy seeing when this happens and seeing the reports of the conservators, because they actually reveal a lot of information about how the monuments were designed and how they were put together, which you can't always see when they're just standing there complete. When they're in pieces, you can see how they've been jointed together and how they've been pegged together and so on. And of course, it's some of those ways in which they were put together, which led to the problems subsequently, like using iron within the iron clamps or iron pegs within them that then corrode, split, and cause the problems that led to the need for the massive amounts of conservation that these monuments have received. So it's really fascinating to look at these, and you begin to understand more clearly the craft level being applied in creating these monuments. You don't see that so much, obviously, in a simple headstone, but in these types of monuments, this is quite complicated. And they're quite sophisticated objects. Some of the features about these monuments were, in a sense, doomed to fail in the long term, which raises an interesting question, which I haven't really got an answer to, is, how long did the people both constructing them and commissioning them imagine these monuments were going to stand for? Were they imagining they were going to stand forever, or were they imagining they had a life, a significance that was perhaps for only 1 or 2 generations? An interesting point to perhaps consider. After these classical revival styles, we move into the one that is most visible in most churchyards, which is the Gothic revival. And that's partly because the boom is continuing, and it's partly because it was an extremely popular style, which overlaps for a long time with classical, but then comes to really dominate the scene. And it was enthusiastically taken up by a lot of the architects who were busily rebuilding churches and conserving them after long periods often of neglect, and building lots of other buildings. A lot of civic buildings are in Gothic revival styles. As you know, many are also in classical revival. But these Gothic revival architects became very excited and did quite a lot of more elaborate monuments for affluent people, such as the one on the top left. The Gothic revival style also was inspired by a renewed interest in Gothic architecture, which was linked to these revivals in terms of the architectural history that was being understood and researched, but it was also being fueled by early antiquarian come archaeological excavations, which revealed more architecture, more layouts of abbeys and so on, and discovered grave slabs belonging to abbots and major figures in these ecclesiastical establishments. And the one at the top right is inspired by the low monuments which we have from the Middle Ages, which were being excavated, were being reported in the paper, and inspired a whole generation of different styles of low monuments that are, to a greater or lesser extent, inspired by exemplars that have been recently uncovered when these ones are being carved and selected. At the bottom, you can see a range of the sorts of designs you can get with heavy amounts of carving, ones that are cut through so you can see through the design, and then on the bottom right, a relatively simple design, which is extremely common. So there's all sorts of ways in which the Gothic revival is represented in most burial grounds. Not quite so common, but still pretty frequent, though usually not with masses of monuments in any one place, except in some cemeteries. We have the Egyptian revival and the Celtic revival. Celtic revival sometimes is very much linked to Irish-inspired monuments, but can be related to more regional Cornish or Anglian Northeast England style crosses. So it can be Celtic and then also slightly other early medieval cross traditions that are used to inspire the designs and the shapes and the proportions of the monuments. Though very rarely are they anything remotely like a copy. They're more taking some of the design features and reworking them in a different way. And these come in a range of materials and a range of sizes, which affect, obviously, relate to the amount of money that the commissioner could afford. The obelisks tend to be in granite, but you get a few in other materials, but granite is by far the most common one. Of course, the Egyptian monuments were in granite, Cleopatra's Needle is in granite, so that's obviously an association which seemed fitting, but you do get them in other materials as well. Another shape which is extremely common for a period is the cross. And you won't see many new crosses in churchyards now because they're frowned upon, and in many places they are forbidden. But you begin to see the idea here that the cross represents Christ's sacrifice, and that's why it's now not allowed. It's seen as not appropriate on an individual person's grave. But this was not the case, as you can see here, in the later part of the 19th century and through into the first part of the 20th. And you can see that it's also far more popular in an Anglican churchyard setting than it is with nonconformists. And one of the things which we have quite notably is that we have many monuments that are more prevalent in one denomination than another. We've only had a few parts of the country where there have been sufficient surveys for this to come out, but where they have been undertaken, there are clear differences between, for example, Roman Catholic and Protestant burial grounds in parts of Ireland, and nonconformist and Anglican burial grounds in parts of Wales. So these differences do occur. There's a lot of overlap in some elements of the design and the shape and the materials and so on, but there's also some differences. And they're partly to do with the theology of those different denominations and what is seen as fitting on the stones, and is partly the management of those burial grounds and what is being allowed to go into them. But you can see here a group of monuments at the bottom left that are crosses. And these reveal another thing which you will often see when you are looking at headstones. And that is that there are, when you have a family group, which this is, people will be often choosing memorials that are similar. They may be similar, but they may not be identical. So if you look at those four crosses in the bottom left, you'll see that three of them look at first glance identical. But in fact, the one on the far left and the one on the far right have exactly the same type scroll design panels on them. But the other one with the relatively simple cross form has a different shaped panel on it. And then we have the one with the ringed cross. So we see there that there is similarity. Sometimes they are identical, but there can also be difference. And this goes back to the idea that there's all these sorts of choice that you can have on your memorial. The memorial is not only thought about in its own terms. You are thinking about it in terms of where it's going to go up onto, where it's going to go in the graveyard. Most stones are being chosen after the person has died and been buried, perhaps as much as a year later, when the ground has settled and the stone can be erected without then immediately subsiding a great deal. Sometimes people are having memorials ahead of their death erected, pre-need memorials, but they are relatively rare. And of course, if they then have inscriptions put on them, we would never know they were pre-need. But we have a few that never have inscriptions on them, so we know that's what's gone on. Most memorials, though, we also know from lots of other sources, are being erected after interment, some time after. So people know exactly where they are going to be putting this monument up in the burial ground, and they can see it in the context of all the other monuments. We can see that with the line of tombs with the urns on the top in your burial ground. That is an example of where people were choosing explicitly very similar designs to be placed one next to another, making a statement about that similarity and togetherness. So that's an important element. And people are choosing whether to be the same or to be different when you put memorials in. And that brings me on to look at just a couple more things which I think are important for us to consider. And that is, as you wander around the burial ground, you will notice that there can be differences as you move around. Now, in part, that will be as different areas are being buried in at different times. So then, especially if you get churchyard extensions, you will see that the monuments might be quite distinct in the different blocks of ground, but it's also for other reasons. And this is an Irish example which shows with the red oval, that's where the Catholics are buried, and that's the top left stone. And where the Protestants, in this place, the Protestants are a majority, with the bottom, with the pale blue oval and the bottom left picture. And you can see all the rectangles on the plan are ledger graves, many in this area having coats of arms on them. And then there is one little bit of the ruined church surviving that's standing to some height and has a roof. And that is a chamber in which the elite family of the area have their memorials, and they're presumably buried under the floor of that building. And they are in there in a discrete, separate space. So you see two things here. In this particular example, you see religion, which you see in large cemeteries across Britain as well, because often different denominations have different zones of the cemetery. But you also see class represented here with the burial, separate burial of the elites in that particular structure. And that pattern of where elites are buried in regional, local elites are buried in a churchyard can also be very revealing. So you will probably notice that certain areas, probably south of the church and out beyond the altar at the east end in that bit of the churchyard, will have some of the earliest monuments and also some of the most prestigious monuments, because that's where often the major family plots lie, in what are considered the most desirable areas. Perhaps some of them are also on some of the paths leading into the churchyard. So where people get positioned in the burial ground can also be indicative of the relative importance of those groups, particularly in the 18th and into the first part of the 19th century. As we move on, things become more organized, and people don't necessarily have the same choices about where their plots might go. And this change through time can also be plotted out. I hope you can see this on this map. I need to update myself and get a nice color version of this, which is sort of computerized and moves through, showing change through time. That sort of dynamic thing could be done now. I just need to get one produced. But you can see top left there that there are just a few monuments in the 1720s. So this, as you know from seeing that broom graph, this is pretty early on. This is an area which actually starts having monuments by the middle of the 18th century in some numbers. And you can see on the right there, the plan of the ruined church in the middle and the path and everything just the same. But the monuments that are on the previous slide are now open symbols on the one on the right, and also the ones that belong to the 1730s and 40s and 50s. And you can see by the 1760s, the churchyard in some areas is becoming much fuller. And you can also see where the new burials, the solid dots, are being located. And so some are continuing the lines that already exist, a bit to the left of the L of the building there, black L, but others to the right and above from that L, you can see are sort of a new cluster. New areas are being opened up that are being buried in for the first time in terms of at least having monuments visible. And by the one that's 1790 at the bottom, you can see there's been gradually a few more, and now some of the ones that are left are actually on the periphery, which suggests that probably all those places in the middle part of the burial ground that don't have a surviving monument probably still had burials in them, and the undertakers and the sexton knew that, and so they were having to go to the edges of the burial ground to use it, and that's in 1790. And in fact, it's only in the next decade that that burial ground is largely abandoned. They don't rebury over those blank areas. A new burial ground is opened up somewhere else, and burial stops here completely. That's a pattern that happens more often in Ireland than it does in England, but we do have areas of burial grounds in England that stop being used as the extensions come on stream. So I think that's an important point to make here. And I would just like to finish with my last slide here by another dimension that's spatial. When you go into a churchyard, you will see the landscape, the plantscape, the paths, the church, chapel, what other buildings there might be, and you'll see the monuments scattered about. They may be in serried ranks, very well organized. They may be scattered about in what appears to be a rather haphazard fashion. It may be very dense with monuments, or maybe less dense. But as you look around, you will see that there are clusters, you will see that there are alignments, however wiggly they might be, but you will also see that some plots are demarcated. In some graveyards, the curbstones have been removed or buried, so that's less obvious than it used to be in more churchyards and cemeteries than it is today. But you'll still often see many of these. And you'll also find other things potentially. You'll find body stones, some of which, as you see in the picture in the top left, are within a curbed plot there, big family plot, and you can see the coffin-shaped body stones marking the burials, only some of which are commemorated on these memorials. And then at bottom left, you can see one with railings. And of course, we had far more railings in our churchyards than we do today in the past, because, of course, they were removed in the Second World War for the war effort, so they weren't really much use in the war effort. On the bottom right, we have a group of stones that are the same long-lived family in a particular area, putting their monuments together. And you need to be aware that these graves have been tended and decorated in different ways. They may have been planted with flowers. That's still a tradition in some places today. They could have had these things called immortelles, which are glass domes, here protected by metal covers, inside of which are either ceramic or glass or plastic, more recent ones with plastic domes, or sometimes cloth flowers inside. And these were extremely popular in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Sadly, very few of these survive. So if you find any of these, or you're planning your management regimes for your burial grounds, these are things to look out for, because they're now quite rare. So I'm sorry I had a bit of a late start. I don't want to completely mess up your program. So I will stop there, but I'm very happy to answer any questions that people might have. There are many aspects of burial grounds that I've not discussed today, and I've rushed through this so that you've got a good overview of some aspects, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of those or anything else that may interest you. I'm particularly keen that people record all this information in a way that is then useful to the community, is a sort of conservation aid and a management aid and an interpretive aid for the public, the congregations, and also local community groups. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that people may have.